Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next African Composers interview. We had one earlier today. Thank you. If you are going to watch us live, thank you very much for joining us. If you'll watch this later as a recorded interview, thank you as well for your interest. We have a guest with us today. He is not an African composer, uh, but he is involved in working with composers from different parts of the world, collecting information, disseminating that information, making it available, collecting accurate data, and informing the public, educating people about composers. I reached out to him some time ago, and that's how we got to, I suppose, connect. And I thought it would be a good idea to have a conversation with him today about this platform that he has put together that is just informing people around the world. The feedback has been unbelievable because of what he has put together, but I will let him talk about that. So thank you once again. I can see some people are already joining us. Thank you very much. So to our guests, first of all, how are you doing, especially considering the pandemic?
I am doing quite well. It has been a bit of a shift to basically stay at home. Luckily, I teach usually during the school year, and so dealing with the pandemic over the summer months isn't so bad. And I live in a small town, so it's not as bad as if I was living in a large city. But still, it's kind of turned the world upside down. So it's an adventure every day.
Okay. Well, it's good to hear that you are coping well, and I hope you continue to cope. And let's see how things go as the weeks and months go by. So, our usual first question, please, can you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So my name is Dr. Rob Deemer. I am originally from a small college town outside of Chicago, Illinois, out in the cornfields of northern Illinois. And kind of a quick story, I was a saxophonist that thought I was going to be a high school band director. Discovered composing while I was in college, and actually went and studied film scoring out at University of Southern California and stayed in Los Angeles for 3 years, thinking I was going to be the next John Williams or Hans Zimmer, but decided ultimately to go back and learn how to become a professor, which I did after several years of going through my doctorate and a few more adventures after that. And I've been teaching at the State University of New York here at Fredonia, New York, which is in Western New York. It's about an hour south of Buffalo. We're right on Lake Erie.
Continue, please. Sorry.
Oh, sure. Once I started here at Fredonia, in addition to composing, I've always been interested in learning about other composers. And I actually had a radio show that I did for a couple of years before I came to Fredonia and then after, where I was basically focusing on living composers around the country. And soon after that, that turned into a project where I was interviewing a bunch of composers, and that turned into a set of articles that turned into a weekly column that I was writing for New Music Box, which is a wonderful online magazine put out through New Music USA. And so I wrote for them on a weekly basis for about 3 years. And one of those articles came at a point where a bunch of folks were having conversations about whether or not women composers should be thought of as composers or women composers. And being not a woman composer, I didn't want to get into that particular conversation, but I thought it would be a good idea, since I knew a lot of women composers, to just put a list together, hyperlinking to their websites, and said, here's 200 names, go find them. Because many musicians I had met over the years had said they'd wanted to play more music by women composers. This was back in 2013. And they just didn't know who they were or where to find them. And so I thought that might be a start. The comment section in that article had about 400 more names that people suggested. And that collection of about 600 names was what I would go back to about 3 years later in the summer of 2016 to start a spreadsheet that actually turned into the project that I've been working on now for about 4 years.
Okay, well done. So the bulk of today's interview will center around talking about this project that you started. But it's interesting to hear that you actually used to interview composers. Whoops. So looking at me and thinking, I wonder what she's going to ask. Is she going to be as good as I am? The good
Well,
thing is,
not at all.
speaking to you today as a composer, so I get a pass. Yes, that's where I found out about this database you started putting together on New Music Box, I think. In fact, I think I have a comment there, but I don't remember what I said. So I saw that and I reached out, and luckily I was able to contact you. Before I ask you to talk about this project, which we are going to dwell upon throughout this interview, I reached out to you because I saw the demographics, the way the project, the composers were arranged, and I thought, well, my continent did not appear to be reflected on the project in a way that I could identify with. So I couldn't fit into any of the boxes, and I thought, well, I'm starting this whole thing called African composers, and some African composers might find the database and may say, well, I'm not included as well. So I thought I'd reach out, and I must tell you this, I was surprised by your response. I thought they're quite accommodating, these people. This Mr. Rob Deemer is quite accommodating. It was instantly, instant response, very polite, very, understanding. You said, thanks for pointing this out, something along those lines. And when you send us the names, we are going to have a conversation about this internally and come back to you. Then I think several months later, I think it was, or a few weeks later, you came back to me and said, yes, we've added this demographic, African composers. And I thought, wow, that was very important for me as somebody working on this platform, because I think that was the first time I saw factually that I was doing something that was having an impact somewhere. Because you talk to people, you write short articles, you gather names, you build a website, but you are not sure if it's having an impact. But to be able to see that that demographic, that category was added, I thought, wow, this is something significant. So thank you, first of all, for even being open to that kind of conversation. I know that there are people who will say, why are you thanking them? You are an entire continent. The problem is everybody must remember it's the person who pays the piper that dictates the tune. We're not paying for this. So the database team has the right to say no. So, I'm going to be myself and just say thank you. And I think that what you did was wonderful, and what you are doing is wonderful and brilliant.
Well, I would thank you for reaching out to me. I will admit, as I mentioned, I'm a composer. My experience is not in sociology, or I kind of came into this entire project almost by accident, and things like this, issues like this, how to be able to how people identify is a huge question, and it has become, especially over, let's say, the last 5 or 10 years, it's always been important, but I think it's become much more of a public dialogue, a much more of an important part of our conversation around the world. Like, who are you? Who am I? Who are you? How do you identify, both with gender, with sexual orientation, with racial and ethnic and cultural heritages? There's so many different ways that we identify ourselves. And I didn't realize what kind of project I was getting myself into when I put this together. Because as I mentioned, I started initially just as like, hey, this would be a good project for my students when I first started, to just have a list of women composers that they could look up, because I knew many of them probably had never heard of these composers. So this would be a way for them to be able to discover them. And it was really fascinating to, as I started putting this list together, and I was thinking about it, I realized that just a list of names and a list of websites wasn't very helpful. because you kind of had to know already what you were looking for, and there wasn't really any way for you to be able to look up someone based on what kind of music they had written or where they lived or what their demographics were. And so that's kind of the only new thing that I brought to the table when I started this, because there were a number, and there still is. There's a number of sites out there that have lists of composers, but uh, how to be able to search for them in a way. And I know your site does a really good job of being able to give us not only a list, but to tell us where they're from and how to get in touch with them. It's really, really useful. And slowly over time, I kind of explored the idea of, well, what if you could search by whether or not they were living or they were historical, and what kind of different genres of music did they write? Did they write choral music? Did they write orchestra music? Were they jazz composers? Did they write musical theater? As well as at least where they were living, if not where they were from. And suddenly, yeah, that kind of just took off initially as women composers. And then after we got, I don't know, it was probably close to 3,000, I'm kind of like, okay, we needed, and I remember that article that you mentioned in New Music Box, because that was kind of where it was a base of a coming out party.
Yes.
Where I'm kind of like, okay, well, here's
Yes.
this thing I did. I think back then it was still a spreadsheet. It was still kind of a searchable spreadsheet. It was very clunky. And I mentioned the first two things that I wanted to do next was to create a website, so you didn't have to go through a spreadsheet, and then to include all composers of color rather than just have it be focused on women, because I knew that composers of color and underrepresented heritages were in the same boat as women composers in terms of underrepresentation and programming and so on. Yeah, and that was what, 2 years ago now, 2018. So it is kind of, as you mentioned, it's kind of blossomed and grown, oftentimes much faster than I was expecting, and it's sometimes difficult to keep up with all of it. But it is heartening to and surprising to realize how many people I'm connecting with, and to be able to have someone, you know, who's living in London of African heritage to like come contact me and say, "Hey, what about this?" And I'm like, "Of course. How would I have known? Why wouldn't I have known that?" But it's I think it is important, because oftentimes when we think of demographics, and again, this is coming from someone who isn't studied in that area, we tend to just use the models that we've always seen. And so oftentimes, like say in a form, they'll give you a list of like the census form here in the United States, and I'm sure the UK has something similar, where it just asks you, here are the different demographics that you can use. And even then, I just looked at that list, I'm like, this isn't enough. We need to have it be more granular. So you could look up, rather than say Asian, you could say, are they from South Asia, like from India, or Southeast Asia from Thailand, or East Asia from Japan or China? And, you know, African, it made total sense, because as you said, it's an entire continent. And as in the same way that we have a category for Latin America, it made sense to be able to have an African category. So I want to thank you for making sure that I'm doing due diligence and making sure that the resources that we have are good representation of composers around the world.
Okay, thank you very much for that kind feedback. Just to let the audience know, it's run largely by volunteers. So they do give out of their time to get this work done. So before we start making demands, I think we probably want to bear that in mind. Speaking of recognizing how people describe themselves and demographics, just to quickly touch on something you said about underrepresented and composers of color. I'm an African composer, and that whole expression doesn't apply to me at all. So, but that's probably news to you, but it doesn't apply to me. I first heard the expression something of color, I think in the last 2 years or 3 years. I thought, well, I definitely am not one of those things. But just to let you know that I need to make it clear to the audience, especially since most of them are Africans, they might not even be aware of what that is. So we just call us Africans. That's enough, but yes, I completely understand where you are coming from, because Africa is divided and there are different racial groups across the continent. So what he means, as I've learned since I came to the West, is when you are referred to as something of color, it just means that you are not a Caucasian. You are not a white person. That's what it means.
Correct. And the terminology, and this is one of the challenges that all of us have in this space, is that the terminology, what terms work and are accepted, is very fluid. And even that term, people of color, composers of color, it's been relatively common here in the States. But at the same time, almost as soon as a term comes into being where it seems to be accepted, there also tends to be movements to be like, wait a minute, that's not the right term. Let's come up with another term. So,
right.
Our side, we usually use the term underrepresented racial, ethnic, and cultural heritages. It's a mouthful, but it has nothing to do with with the color of one's skin. It just has to do with all of those different things. So it's a challenge, and it's tricky to be able to make sure that I'm not saying the wrong things or that are confusing. And I've gotten used to making mistakes in public and making sure.
Oh gosh, don't worry about
we're doing
it.
the best we can.
I think what matters is I think as many of us as possible remembering the origins of these expressions. So, for example, underrepresented is inaccurate for an African who is sitting in Africa because the person is overrepresented or just represented just fine. I think what matters is when we talk to people is trying to recognize, who am I talking to? So to me as an African, you are a minority, but I would never call you that. Don't worry, we don't call our foreigners minorities. We just call them anything. And don't worry. I've never heard the expression minority before, in fact, until I came to Britain. These are dicey subjects, but one thing I think more and more of us, and I don't mean you, I'm talking generally now, people need to respect is, if an African says I'm not a person of color, it's because that's new to them and that's not necessary to them. It's basically a useless expression for me, because you are British and you are a minority in Britain. You could be called a person of color because you all have reached an agreement some time ago. I don't know when, but for me, it's just an unnecessary term. So you might say, well, when you are in Britain, maybe accept what you are called. I don't know. I will call myself a person. If you want me to call you a person of, I don't know, something, let me know. But I'm a person, and that's just fine by me. But I think it's a really interesting one. As long as we recognize who we are talking to and how they don't see themselves as minorities or underrepresented, I'm not it. So if I'm not it, I can't pretend to be in that category.
It's a and it is one of those things where it's always good for myself to be reminded that oftentimes when we're using this language, it's through our own lens and the viewpoint, and
the world stage.
Absolutely,
the world stage is like, what's that?
Right. So when we're talking about, say, programming, let's say, because we started kind of thinking of this as and the situation here in the States, and then slowly it will grow out. It's very easy for someone in my position to kind of look at it through my own lens of who I am and my own experiences, and then use terminology that kind of comports to that. But you're absolutely right. It's like, I'm using the term minority or person of color or any of those types of things.
Yeah.
Ultimately,
imagine getting to the United Nations.
We want to be able to get rid of all of that. And we're all just people. We're all just composers. And we just want to make sure that the composers that aren't being programmed get programmed. Like that there's a large group of composers out in the world who, for many reasons, no one knows who they are. They don't even quite know where to look because they've been so focused on this relatively focused canon of composers, primarily from Europe, that is kind of taken up in the, at least in classical music, has kind of taken up all the room. It's taken up all of the oxygen, and that's what I'm hoping for as we go through this project, is to basically break down those break that bubble, break down the walls, whatever term you want to use, to be able to get people to look for composers and voices and music outside of what they're used to.
Is that because you are a teacher? You think there is value in learning beyond what you already know? Because some may say, well, what is wrong with performing well-known works by respected composers? They are respected for a reason. Are you trying to add more knowledge because you're a teacher? You feel that knowledge should be expanded?
It's a great question. I think in part, yes. But I also think, like, I've had a fair amount of experience working with young composers even before college, so in secondary and primary schools. And what I have found is that it is much easier for them. There's, let's see, what's a good way to put it? It's easy for children and young adults to not even allow themselves the idea of trying something out like composing, because they've never seen anyone like them do it, or they don't know of anyone who's like them. So to be perfectly honest, even when I was growing up, I didn't know that many living composers. So irrespective of who they were, just the fact that just living composers in general, it didn't seem like that was something that I could do, because I assumed that all the really good composers were already dead. And
Wait a minute. Did you watch this morning's interview?
No, I didn't.
The person I interviewed said the same thing. The person I interviewed said the same thing. You will not believe it. He said he thought that all the composers were dead, so he was surprised he living composers. And I said that was my experience as well. I can't believe this. Continue, sorry.
It's absolutely true, and I think a lot of that has to do. It's, if you grow up and you see so many people, I don't know, being teachers, being any type of career paths, it's easy for you to imagine, oh, I could grow up and be a teacher, I could be a lawyer, I could be a doctor, so on and so forth. If you don't see any composers, it's very hard for you to imagine. Like, you could imagine being a violinist or a pianist because you see many of them out there, but it's much more difficult to imagine being a composer, because for a long time, I think it's gotten better in the last maybe 20 years or so, but for a long time, there just weren't that many out there, and they weren't very public. It wasn't something that folks outside of maybe large cities even knew about. That goes double, triple, 10 times, 100 times for women composers, and basically composers who aren't white, at least here in the States. Okay. So that seemed to be something that I saw as, okay, if we want to have more people composing at an early age, just to explore, not necessarily to be like a professional composer, but just to expand the idea that composing is a fun thing to do, and it's something that musicians can do, the more experience that students can have playing music by people who are like them, I think ultimately over time that will grow the discipline. So that's one reason. I mean, there's many reasons to do it, but that's one reason from my own personal experience, that I thought, if you go to a school and, let's say, 3/4 of the student body is Black, but, or from African heritage, and almost all of the music, or all of the music that they play, happens to be composers from Germany and Africa, or Germany and England and France, it's harder for those students to connect with that. So that was at least one idea that I had in terms of how to be able to do that. And hopefully that can also happen if you go to an orchestra concert. Orchestras are worried about their audiences dwindling. Well, maybe if they played more music from people, from voices, and from cultures who are like the people who aren't coming to the orchestra concerts, then maybe you might be able to bring those audiences in. So it's basically just trying to expand the idea of what concert music, classical music, whatever you want to call it, is, and make it that much better.
Hmm. I don't want to ask this question, but it's almost like an
Oh,
automatic one. There might be some people who will say, and I've seen these comments online a lot. What is Why is it necessary to program works by certain composers because of how they look, or their religion, or their ages, or name the demographic breakdown, and the category? Why not just program works by good composers? That's not my
uh,
question. I've seen it online because you've just taught me something. So I think I've changed my stance on something during this interview. But listen, I'm an engineer. I hear people say, let's try and encourage young girls to go into engineering and STEM subjects. And I
sure.
think, why not just let those who want to do STEM subjects do STEM? But I think we learn every day. So sorry, take it away.
No, absolutely, and I get that question a lot. The challenge with that is, and this is something that I've just kind of learned, more or less just over time, and as I've been kind of bumping through this project for the last 4 years, um, is that the idea of good music, and this is an opinion, this is my own opinion, but I think the idea of what is good music is in part learned and taught. So what happens is that uh, students today are learning what good music is because their teachers are providing them that music, and they're saying, this is good music and this is why. And those teachers learned what they think is good music from their teachers and their experiences. And sometimes it's, oh, I've played this piece and I really like it. I've played that piece, not so much. Uh, but I think there's a lot of it has to do. I'm not saying that good music isn't good music, but the idea of just saying something like, "Oh, I only program good music," that concept of what you think is good music and what isn't good music has so many connections to the biases of both that individual and their teachers and their teachers and their teachers. And it tends to be a closed system, unfortunately, where it's real, like it's been additive but very, very slowly. Like, I remember reading in, because I used to study conducting as well as composition, and I would read these books on these different conductors. And maybe 50 years ago, Stravinsky was still seen as, oh my goodness, you're performing Stravinsky. I mean, it was like that was scandalous even 50 years ago, that he wasn't really considered a canonic composer. He wasn't someone who was really considered part of the group of composers that were really accepted. But then now, 50 years later, of course, Stravinsky is, and Shostakovich, and a number of other 20th century composers. But it's taken a long time for even those composers to kind of slowly become accepted into that kind of insular classical music concept. And if it's hard for someone like Stravinsky to break into that group, oh my goodness, then it's so hard for, for composers who have just been living in the last 50 years, especially because there's plenty of articles and references to composers out, back in the day, 100 years ago, who would write things like, "Oh, women can't write music. They might be able to write parlor songs or piano music or something like that." I mean, there's been a lot of bias, and we've been dealing with that, the bias against women, the bias against non-white races and ethnicities for a long time. And now it's a matter of kind of trying to provide resources to allow folks to break out of those habits and look outside of them. I think that's kind of where I'm coming. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yes, everything is really, really clear. And you can see some of the comments that are coming in fact. That's really interesting. So I think what I've taken away from that, I've taken so many things away from that, in fact, but one of them is that there are people who are pushing against existing biases actively by trying to educate the teachers, parents, families, music halls, those who program music, the media. And there are people who are just providing information. So for example, I see myself as somebody who is just providing information and hoping that I push it in front of the right people. I've never been somebody who is inclined to push against something, because there are two ways to fix a problem. You either push forward or you pull the other person back.
Yeah.
I've never been inclined to reach out to people to say, you are doing this incorrectly. You must take these composers, you must program them, you are being unfair. I rather believe in pushing the information out there and saying, listen, you can no longer pretend that you don't know about African composers, because this database has a category, African. The fact that the word exists there means there are composers who fit into that category.
And one can find out on your site, there are a lot of them. And that's going to be part of these things aren't going to change overnight. They're not going to change even within a year, but slowly over time, the more people who are even starting to think of this, I run into a lot of folks who, when they think about this, and I know I was the same way. I didn't realize when I was younger and a student, I didn't think, why would there be any reason why, if someone wanted to be a composer, why wouldn't they become a composer? But for many folks who didn't fit within what this composition professor or that composition professor's idea of, oh, you don't write the kind of music, or you're not the type of person who I think will be a good composer, so I'm not even going to encourage you to do it. So many composers over time have basically just, they stopped, or they never started, because they never thought that they could achieve that. And the idea of convincing people to kind of reimagine or look at it through a different lens. I've had a lot of people kind of go, oh, wow, I never even thought of that. And now that I've thought, now that they're starting to think about it, they're like, oh my goodness, I'm seeing all of these things that need to be changed. And once their eyes are opened, now it's just a matter of, okay, what are the best ways to go about it? And to your point of the pushing and the pulling, I will admit I'm a bit of the same way. I'm not someone who's going to really get into someone's face and really push. But one of the things and that's just me, that's my own personality, but I'm trying to surround myself with people who are better at that. So because those, pushing really does help. One of the things that I've been trying to do over the last year or so, year and a half, is in addition to having these databases where people can search for a composer or a work, and we're building many of them. We have 3 with orchestra, wind band, and art songs. We're currently building a chamber music database and a choral database, so folks can, if they wanted to find a choral piece that was 5 to 10 minutes long by an African composer, click, 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 and then they would find all of that music. So it may take a year or 2 to be able to get to that point, but that's the goal. But one of the other projects that we've been doing is to look at programming, specifically currently with orchestras, but we're going to build that out as well with other genres. So I took a look at 120 symphony orchestras here in the States for their season in 2019 to 2020, and kind of analyzed all of their programming and then put that analysis up on the site. And it was amazing how many people saw that and how many orchestras saw that. And I can't say that anything that I put up online made any difference, but I know that there's been a lot of conversations with orchestras in terms of how to, that basically their numbers aren't very good. For many years, it was only about, say, 2 to 3% works by non-white composers or women composers, and slowly now it's gotten better. But sometimes it helps to have something that concrete, where it's literally just, we're looking at all the music that you're programming, and here's how much of it is by dead white guys, and here's how much of it is by folks who don't fit in that category, and then to compare them across the country, so they get to see what their orchestra is like compared to other orchestras. And then one of the other projects we're going to be doing is doing the same thing but over time, to see how that's changed. So maybe go back 5 years and then to see, okay, when did these things really change? Why did they change? And then really dig into, how are they changing? What are the orchestras that are doing better programming? What are they doing to make sure of that? And then to be able to share that out with the rest of the orchestras. And then hopefully over time, we can convince folks to not to never perform composers like Beethoven or Mozart, but maybe not quite so many works, so that they give room for other composers who aren't in that those lists of the composers that we might have think of as just like the traditional canon.
Right. Okay. It's interesting. I mean, how they would find the balance, I don't know, because it's all about the push and pull. For example, what I do is I would never sit down and say, instead of picking this expression, I've heard it so much. Some of these expressions, dead white men or dead white people, I don't understand why. Instead, I look for how to fill up the cup instead of saying let's reduce. So I don't know how they will get that balance. I really wish them the best with that. One thing I do want to highlight is, I think what is coming across is a difference in culture, where if somebody in a classroom and a teacher will say you should not compose, you are not the type. I think it's cultural. I think that is, if a group, I think like I said, they're referred to as minorities. So people who are not Caucasians, for example, in the US, are referred to as minorities. And the same thing happens in Britain, all these terms. You wouldn't hear that where I come from. So the teacher would not say people like you, because people like you are people like the teacher. Everybody's effectively the same thing.
Right.
I go back to the engineering conversation, where people in this part of the world, the West, will say we need more girls in engineering. But where I come from, we just walk into it. It's not, there's nothing there, nobody's there to stop you because everybody's doing it, It's a cultural thing that is happening. I think there is a difference between where I come from and this part of the world. There's this representation question. If the teacher doesn't believe in the student because there is difference in the demographic, that kind of conversation will happen. Yeah. I cannot fathom that happening where I come from based on skin color. Maybe based on money. So the teacher might say, you can't afford the violin, I don't think you should bother. But we are kind of a very different culture where I come from. Everybody's just expected to do everything. In fact, you are more likely to hear a parent say, don't study music, there's no money in it. That's changing now, though. That's changing. People are moving away from wanting the children to become engineers and pilots and lawyers and doctors. And it's becoming more open towards things like music and the arts. Right. I think there's a cultural thing. I think.
I would absolutely agree. And I think if you've been following any of the things that have been happening here in the States over this summer, there's a lot of things that our country is being forced to come to terms with in terms of our culture that has to do with how people who aren't white have been treated over the last 250 years, or the entire history of our country. And it's different than in other countries, I think. And I'm not an expert on what it is in all of the different cultures, but I know that it has become, even when you mentioned money, the fact that so many more people who are Black or who are from Latin America, or they don't have, in general, those families tend to be lower on the financial scale than people who are white, for many reasons. It's the mechanism, the social mechanism of all of that. It makes it really difficult to be able to bring things up to the point where we can have that conversation and assume that everyone is on an equal footing. And so at this point, that's kind of where this project initially kind of came out, that there were people who weren't getting their music performed. There were a lot of voices that were not being heard musically, for many reasons. And at least, to be able to get the information out there to allow folks to be able to change on their own, and then maybe nudge them in different ways through advocacy and analysis, to be able to change that. That's kind of what we're hoping for. And we know it'll take a while, but that's kind of the world that I find myself in, kind of, like I said, almost accidentally over the last 4 years.
Yes, I think you've been drawn from trying to solve a national issue, what you identified, or local, what you identified locally, or within a particular demographic, women, to now talking to the world.
Yep.
I think this is what has happened, yes, because again, like I said at the beginning, I really would prefer not to talk about demographics and all these topics. I really don't want to talk about them, but I think it's how do we, for example, as Africans, get into the conversation without being pushed to the side because of the demographic, the way it's broken down. How do you also manage to talk to the world without ignoring the internal issues you are trying to solve? I don't know how you're going to slice that bread, but
yeah, there's a lot of big questions to be asked and answered. And we're going to mess up doing it, but the thing is, as we slowly go through it, I absolutely agree. I mean, I've had conversations. I've asked whether or not should we even have a demographics thing at all on the site, and I can see the point, but at the same time, I love the idea of being able to just search through African composers or composers from South Asia and discover. I mean, because oftentimes if you have this huge list, because we've now got over 4,000 composers in it, you have to scrunch it down a little bit, and to make it manageable and digestible, and just to be able to find new voices around the country and around the world and around the country. Obviously, at this point, it's like you said, it's gotten way bigger than that, and that's one of the things that I'm still in the process of kind of figuring out how to adjust. This did start from a very small point, and now it's this, I guess it's a very large thing. And so now it's a matter of kind of reconfiguring how we think about the project and what are the ways that we can make sure that it's as good as it can be for as many people around the world as possible.
Gosh, so many questions, so many questions for you to grapple with. I did say we shouldn't spend more than 45 minutes on this, but we might go over. Let's see how we can make sure we scrunch things down.
You bet.
It began life as a database. So we're talking about the composers database that you worked on, but it's now affiliated with the Fredonia State University of New York. So that is a major leap for you. How did you feel when that happened? And tell us what's happened basically. What's the affiliation about?
Sure. No, it's thank you for asking. Basically this was, for several months or for several years, it was just me typing things into a spreadsheet, and then we created the website. And once we started having more people working on it other than myself, it got to the point where I'm like, at some point I would love to be able to at least provide some financial help to the folks who are helping me. And so I went to the university that I teach at here, State University of New York at Fredonia, and basically asked them, would it be okay if we created this institute, which it's not what it sounds like. Usually we think of an institute, you actually go up to a building and you walk in. I mean, it's really more of just uh, a virtual organization that is affiliated with the university, and they don't give us any money because it's not that kind of university. We don't have a lot of money. It's a teaching institution. But what it does do is it at least allows for us to be able to do fundraising and bring and apply for grants, bring money in, and then we have an account through our foundation here that we can then disperse and do things like pay for our website, and I can pay stipends to many of the folks who've been helping us over the last couple years. I myself don't take any salary. I don't take any stipends because of who I am. I'm a straight white man with tenure, which is kind of, I've said that as kind of like, this is I'm the poster child for someone who has privilege and doesn't have the problems that the composers that we're trying to encourage. So I know it may
Sorry,
sound strange,
I
but
have to interrupt
here
you. I
it's
have to interrupt you.
for myself.
Okay.
This has just become a mission of mine, and
Okay.
I I get a salary through the university because I still teach full time, and I do all of this on my own time. But it is really important to be able to make sure that the people who are helping are being supported as best we can, and to make sure that I'm not benefiting off of that. And I guess if I was to say if I've benefited, it's because this is just really a lot of fun. And to be able to meet people like you, and to be able to have composers come to me and say, "Hey, thank you so much. I just got a piece that was purchased, or these folks performed it because they found it on your site." Or teachers come to me and say, "Thank you." I mean, those things. That's that's enough benefit for me.
I'm trying to interrupt you back then. Sorry, just to let you know, we've gone beyond 45 minutes. Are you okay to continue for like, I don't know, till 50 minutes? Good. Thank you.
We can finish up. Sorry for talking so long.
No, gosh, no problem. I had to try to interrupt, especially, I mean, in addition, to ask why being who you are should prevent you from getting paid. I don't understand. But then you said, well, you've got tenure. So for anybody who doesn't know, I believe that means basically you've got a job as a professor for life. You can't be fired as a professor. Is that what that means?
Correct.
So it's not because of your demographics, because that's a bit disturbing when you said you're a straight white man. Again, the audience may not know. Some people might, but I don't know how many would. If I was still in Africa, I might not have concerned myself with these topics, honestly, because I've got my own thing to think about. But I'm not saying, obviously, a lot of people are online now, so they may have heard the expression before. It's quite disturbing because I work doing this for free. I would not tell somebody because I'm a Black woman I should not be paid. If there is an offer that, okay, you know what, we're going to sponsor the African Composers Platform with a stipend every year of this amount to pay for the website, I'll say, oh, don't give it to me because I'm a Black woman. Hello, your demographics should not determine and dictate how much you can fill up your belly and feed your family. So I just want to check that we are on the same page. I'm not sure.
As you mentioned before, some of this is cultural. And here in the States, there are concerns by many that that you want to make sure. Let's see, what's the best way to put this? The idea of someone like myself benefiting when you're trying to make benefits for others. I know it may sound strange to folks outside of this culture, but here it's a touchstone. There have been I've had a number of folks assume that I've been making money, and I've had to actually make sure that folks go, no, I'm not, because there have been complaints about it. And so that's the only reason why I bring it up. And I love the fact that that different cultures and different societies outside of here hear it completely differently.
I'm confused. I'm not clear. So you start a database, you put in all this work, and there is money coming in, a little bit, a stipend for those who are doing the back work, right, at the back end.
Yeah.
And you are one of them. But because of the color of your skin, because of your orientation, and what else? Because of your gender, you are not allowed, or you have decided not to be part of those receiving the stipend.
Yes, yes.
Sorry.
There's
That
no.
is
It would be seen as controversial if I was to be making a lot of money off of something like this here.
the live interview. Wait. I must be missing something. There's something that I'm not understanding. I must be missing something. Somebody starts a database, there's money coming in, then the money is being shared to help keep the work going. But a particular person, because of demographics, cannot earn money from it.
I'm sure other people could. I've just decided that the money that comes in really needs to go to the people, because most of the folks who have been helping us, oftentimes they're younger, they're maybe still in school, or they're just out of school, and basically, I'm not rich, but I have a full-time job. I can afford to make sure that the money goes to help the volunteers that have been coming in. So we don't pay them a salary on a monthly basis or anything like that. But when we do have our fundraising, the folks who have been helping us a lot over the previous year, I've been trying to at least be able to help support them with stipends after the fact. So it is a confusing and complicated thing sometimes, and I describe it as navigating through a minefield for the last several years. But ultimately, I think the work that we've been doing is good and has been useful, and I'm hoping that as we continue to build it and improve it, that it will just be that much more better.
I'm hearing two things. I'm hearing you decided not to take any money. I'm also hearing there were complaints. I just want to wrap up that point before we end the interview, but I'm hearing two things. It's either you decided or there were complaints that made you decide, which means that's how things are done in your country.
I decided ahead of time. So even before there were complaints, I had already made the decision. But there have been folks who, not knowing that I wasn't bringing in any money, when they hear institute, sometimes when people hear that this is an institute, it's not just like a project, but there are many universities that provide funds for something like a center or an institute. And it's easy to assume that the director of the institute is making a salary because of that position. And so that's part of the reason why I brought it up, was just it's useful for me to let everybody know that that's not the case in this particular instance.
Okay. Do you know of other directors who give up their own salaries as well? Directors of institutes?
Sure. I'm sure there are others that do the same thing for the same reasons.
Oh, okay. It's an interesting reason, but I don't know what to say. I'm from a different continent, so I suppose
It's okay. And I love even the fact that you've been asking about it is like, wow, I didn't think that anyone would have thought the other way. So this is wonderful. I'm glad we're having the conversation.
No, I don't understand. I just, you know what? If it is you deciding,
yeah,
I really would like to give up this amount to spread it across my team. That's really generous.
Yeah. It's basically an in-kind donation back into into it on a conceptual basis.
Okay, so it's not to do with your demographics, because if it is, then that's a very different conversation. That's disturbing. That's the word I will use. If you don't mind, I'm not going to, prevaricate. The British will say, don't faff around. I just hope that's a clean word. I've heard it everywhere. I'm sure it is. I heard it on university campus, so I'm sure it is. But no, I'm sorry, but I don't believe you should not withhold money because of what a person is, their religion. their sexual orientation, their demographics, their age. If they're competent, they can do the job well, pay them. If you, out of the kindness of your heart, decide not to be paid, that's down to you. If you feel pressure because of your demographic, somebody needs to be having a conversation. Somebody, I don't know who, somebody in your institute and even the university needs to have a conversation, because why should I not be paid because I'm an African woman or I am a Black person? That is the beginning of the problem that you are trying to solve. You're going back to the problem to recreate the problem in your country. I mean, the whole demographics and divisions thing.
Right.
Don't judge me because of what I look like, who I am, who I worship, if I worship at all. This interview is supposed to be about music, but that was really interesting to hear. Not quite clear, but as long as it's your decision, no pressure on you to make that decision, that's better. Look at me, I'm teaching a professor, but sorry.
This is great.
Okay.
This is great. I love it. Thank you.
Okay. As long as you are free of conscience, please. Nobody should be imprisoned by.
No. This is like I said, this project has been from the outset. It was my choice to get started, and as I've been kind of going down this path, it's been nothing but positive in terms of learning and learning about myself, learning about so many other composers, and learning about music and hearing so much good music from composers I'd never heard of. It's been really wonderful.
How do you feel? I'm sorry for taking liberties now because we have gone beyond 45 minutes, but how do you feel when somebody sends you a complaint about how you've represented the category or something? I hope my own reaching out to you did not come across in that way. I tried to be as balanced
Not
as
at all.
possible.
Not at all.
Have you received any kind of negative feedback around how you've represented a particular country, continent, group, and how do you feel since you do this for free?
We really haven't had many complaints on that scale. Sometimes it's been we've had some issues with making sure that the composers who are in the database are okay with how they're represented. And while many composers have self-reported into the database, others have been submitted by other people who, person A knows, right? So, and so what we're actually doing right now is we're creating a list of, basically we're creating a contact list for all of the 3,500 plus living composers, and then we're going to reach out and ask everybody, is it okay for us to have you in the database? And can you check to make sure that the way that you're being represented is there? And that's obviously out of respect and making sure that it's easy to be taken away by the project of like, oh, we just want to find all the composers and make sure that people know about these folks. But we also want to make sure that we're respecting the composers themselves. So we're doing that. But most of the time, with your question about African composers on the outset, which is how we met, a lot of it has just been, hey, have you thought about adding X, or Y, adding a new idea, and what's the best way to be able to do it? I think the majority, huge majority, has been absolutely supportive and really have just come at it from a supportive point of view. This would be useful. We've had folks ask about biracial or multiracial to be able to look up something, again, because that's how they identify, and how to be able to make it such, in the same way that you were asking about having a category for African composers, that we've had other folks ask about that particular kind of categorization. So I'm, like I mentioned, I still go back to, I'm still just a composer-ish. I guess I'm probably a lot of other things, but I just love the idea of hearing from everybody else and finding our way through to find what is the best way to be able to let folks present their identities as best we can.
Oh gosh, I feel almost pained on your behalf and on behalf of your team with all the feedback you must be getting, especially creating categories, not being sure about how to categorize people. But well done. Don't be discouraged. Well done. keep it up. I think it's an absolutely brilliant project. And the way you take feedback again from, it was almost 2 years ago now, was it, when I contacted you? I was surprised at the response. I thought, wow, they actually are accommodating what I'm asking for. And then you came back and said, yeah, we've added the category. I thought, I cannot believe this has happened. So keep it up. Don't be discouraged. I also get feedback sometimes, and I think, okay, he who pays the piper, but all right, just calm down. So, wow, well done. It has been an interesting conversation. You've already answered my last few questions around, your early challenges and where you plan to go with the project. We did not cover as much as I think we could have, and we covered more than I expected us to cover. In fact, we even went into a topic that I really don't like talking about, demographics, but we had to because of the way your database is structured into categories. Wow. And I think I did most of the talking as well. So
no, it's wonderful. This has been so much fun. I'm so glad you've asked me to do this.
Okay, well done. Well done. I'm glad I could talk to you. Thank you very much to everyone who is still watching us. Thanks for the comments. Thank you to anybody who will watch this later as a recorded interview. Please feel free to send in your questions. Feel free to reach out to Dr. Rob Deemer. He's doing a brilliant job, and he's helping his colleagues as well. And they are working together to build up this database. You can find the database online. I am terribly sorry, I cannot remember the link. Can you remind us, please?
Sure. You just find it at composerdiversity.com, and we'll make sure that there's a link in the comments.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So thank you once again. I'll just quickly type this in, composerdiversity.com. There you go, everybody. Please visit this link to see the work that our guest of today is doing. Click that. Show that to the crowd. Okay, there it is. Fantastic. Thank you once again. Thanks for your time, and I hope you keep in touch. Keep up the good work, and all the best with your future endeavors.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.